When I first saw Laura, she immediately caught my attention. She was that quiet girl who seemed to exist on her own wavelength. Her mysteriousness beckoned, and I fell in love with her at first sight. But one day I realized that behind her calmness was something dark and frightening. When I met Laura at a party at a friend's house, she seemed strange but charming in her own way. While everyone else was partying loudly, Laura stood at the window, staring wistfully at the lights of the city. I approached her and tried to make conversation. "Aren't you bored here alone?" I asked. She turned around and a slight smile appeared on her face. "I just like to watch people. They're so different." At first I thought she seemed a little unsociable, but I sensed that there was more to her silence than that. We only talked for about 15 minutes, but it felt like I'd known her forever. She was smart, well-read, and a little mysterious. At the end of the evening, I worked up the courage to ask her out. We started dating, and I quickly got used to her habit of often shutting up and going into her thoughts. Laura rarely talked about her past, and I tried not to push her, respecting her privacy. A year later we were married, and I was sure our marriage would be perfect. First warning sign. It all started a few months after the wedding. One day I noticed that Laura would often lock herself in her room and not come out for long periods of time. She said she was just reading or writing a journal. I didn't pay much attention to it. Everyone is entitled to their own personal space. One evening when I got home from work, the house was engulfed in silence. I knew Laura was home. Her car was parked in the driveway. I quietly approached her room and heard strange noises. It was like someone was whispering. I knocked. "Laura? Is everything all right?" There was silence for a moment. Then the door opened and she peeked out, smiling. "Yeah, I'm fine. I was just on the phone." But there was no one in the room. I felt a slight chill run down my spine, but I decided not to ask too much. Maybe she was just talking to a friend on speakerphone. The next day, I noticed the oddity again. Laura was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and didn't take her eyes off the window. I walked over and gave her a gentle hug. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing much," she answered quietly. When I looked at her phone, which was on the table, I noticed that the screen was locked. She always left it open. When I looked up, Laura was already looking at me, and a shadow of worry flashed in her eyes. Secret hobby. One night I woke up and realized Laura wasn't there. I cautiously stepped out of the bedroom and walked down the hallway. The light in her room was on and I heard the whispering again. I stepped closer and quietly opened the door. Laura was sitting on the floor, surrounded by some papers and an old laptop. When she noticed me, her face turned pale. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply. "I just heard a noise." "Are you okay?" "Yeah. I'm fine. Just working on a project." I apologized and left, but something inside made me come back to her door a few minutes later. I heard her say, "He didn't suspect a thing. Everything's under control." Inside, everything turned upside down. I tried to convince myself that it was just a conversation with a friend, but doubt was already brewing in my mind. Strange calls. The next day I decided to talk to her sister Kate. She had always been supportive of Laura and could probably know what was going on. When I told her about the late-night calls and strange behavior, Kate looked concerned. "Are you sure she was talking to someone? Maybe just to herself?" "I don't know. But I have a strange feeling." Kate thought about it. "You know, Laura used to make up friends when she was a kid. She could talk to someone invisible for hours. Her parents even wanted to see a psychologist, but then it went away." I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it be that her habit of talking into the void was back again? Truth in recording. The next night I put the recorder by the door of her room to see who she was talking to. In the morning, while Laura was in the shower, I checked the tape. My heart pounded faster when I heard her voice. "No, I won't tell him. He can't know." Then another voice, a low, masculine voice. "He will know, Laura. It's inevitable." I almost dropped the phone. I was sure no one was home but the two of us. I repeated the recording several times, trying to pick up any hint of fakery, but everything sounded absolutely real. When Laura returned, I tried to speak to her directly. "Laura, I know you talk to someone at night. Who is it?" Her face contorted into a strange grimace. "You're just tired, Jake. It's all in your head." But I could see the panic in her eyes. I knew she was hiding something. New find. That evening I decided to look in her room while Laura was out jogging. On the table was an old laptop, turned on and without a password. I opened the last file I'd looked at and saw dozens of entries labeled, Session 1, Session 2. I turned one of them on and heard Laura talking to someone on a video link. But the screen was black. "You have to tell him the truth," the same male voice said. "I can't. He won't understand. You can't protect him if he finds out." That's when I heard the sound of the door opening. I froze like a hunted animal. Laura stood on the threshold, her face pale and tense. "You weren't supposed to see that." Laura was standing in the doorway, her face pale as chalk. I frantically tried to think of a way to explain why I was going through her laptop. But she spoke first. "You weren't supposed to see that, Jake." "Laura, who is this man? Why are you talking to him at night?" She lowered her gaze, and I saw a mixture of fear and despair in her eyes. "It's hard to explain." "Try." I clenched my fists, trying not to snap. "I just want to know the truth." Laura sat down on the bed and was silent for a long time. I sat down next to her, trying to be calm. "Remember when I told you about my family?" She finally said. "You said your parents died when you were a teenager." "Yes. But I didn't tell the whole truth." She took a deep breath and continued. "My father was a psychiatrist. He worked in a private clinic. Sometimes he brought patients home when he couldn't keep them in the hospital. One day he brought a man named Brian. He was strange, always quiet. But when my parents went to bed, I could hear him talking to himself. I was just a kid, but even then I knew something was wrong with him. I was trying to figure out where it was going. And then what? A few months later, my father disappeared. My mother said he'd gone to a scientific conference. But he never came back. And a week later, Brian disappeared too. Mom tried to find him, but the police closed the case. They said he'd run away. I felt a chill go through me. Do you think this Brian has something to do with what's happening now? I don't know. But a couple years after that, my mom disappeared, too. Just left the house and never came back. I lived with my grandmother, but she always avoided talking about it. We were sitting in silence when suddenly Laura's cell phone rang. She looked at the screen and turned pale. "Who is it?" I asked. "The number is blocked." I nodded and she pressed the answer button. "Hello." A few seconds of silence, and then a hoarse voice. "You lied to him. He needs to know the truth." Laura dropped the phone from my hands and I grabbed it, but the call had already been dropped. I quickly opened the call log, no entries. "Laura, who was that?" "I don't know." But the voice sounded so familiar. I decided to talk to Kate, her sister, again. We met at a cafe on the other side of town. When I told her about the strange conversations and calls, she looked scared. "Jake, are you sure she told you everything?" "I don't know. She mentioned some guy named Brian. Have you heard of him?" Kate frowned. "Brian. I think I heard the name from my grandmother. But she always said it was just a patient of my father's." I felt anxiety growing inside. Laura is sure he had something to do with her parents' disappearance. Are you saying he might have had something to do with their deaths? I don't know yet. But there's something else. I showed her the laptop recording. Kate listened to the tape carefully and frowned. "Jake, it can't be Brian. He's dead." "What?" "Yeah, I remember my grandmother saying his body was found in the river a couple years after he went missing." It got me thinking. If Brian's dead, who's talking to Laura? I called Mike and asked him to check the archives for Brian's death. While he searched for information, I returned home. When I opened the door, Laura was sitting on the living room floor surrounded by old photographs. She was holding an old faded photo of a man with a thick beard. "That's him, Jake." Brian. Where did you find this picture? In an old album. I thought it had been thrown away. I looked at the picture closely. The man's face was sullen and a little scary. But something about him seemed vaguely familiar. That's when Mike called. Jake, you're not gonna believe this. What? Brian's really dead. But the weird thing is, he had a twin brother named Brian. I was shocked. 2 Brians. Yeah. They were both patients of Laura's dad, but when one died, the other one was sent to another clinic. And you know what the weirdest thing is? The second Brian ran away a few months ago. I looked at Laura, and she seemed to understand. He's back. He'd been watching me the whole time. I went to the window and suddenly I noticed something strange. There was a twig with a ribbon lying on the windowsill outside. I opened the window and picked it up. It was the red satin ribbon Laura had worn in her hair as a child. Jake, what is it? It's a ribbon. Was it here the whole time? No. I didn't leave it here. I looked around and noticed movement behind the fence. A man in a dark jacket was standing there looking right at us. I snapped out of my seat and ran outside, but he was gone. It was only on the sidewalk that I noticed a piece of paper. I promised to come back. She's still mine. I clutched the note, feeling a chill run down my back. Laura came up behind me and gently touched my arm. He won't stop, she whispered. I won't let him hurt you. That night we decided not to stay home. I took Laura to Kate's, and I went back to Mike's. We checked all the records again and found an old article. The Bryan twins, brothers bound not only by blood but by mania. One died, the other ran away. I didn't know how to keep Laura safe, but I knew one thing: this man considered her his and wasn't going to back down. Some shadows from the past are too tenacious to disappear without a trace. Especially if they're fueled by obsession and madness. After I learned of the second Brian's existence, I felt uneasy. If he had escaped from the clinic, then he might actually have gone back to Laura. I felt like we were running out of time. This man was clearly not going to back down. I went back to Kate's house to pick up Laura, but the house was quiet. I called her, but there was no answer. Everything went cold inside. I ran into the house and found Kate in the kitchen. She was sitting on the floor, covering her face with her hands. Where's Laura? I screamed. I don't know. She went out into the garden and didn't come back. I thought she'd just gone to get some air. Everything inside of me turned upside down. I realized he'd taken her. I ran out into the garden and noticed boot prints in the soft earth. They led to an old shed that Kate hadn't used for a long time. I quietly opened the door and froze. In the semi-darkness I could make out the silhouette of a person. It was Laura. She was sitting on an old crate, bound and gagged. Laura. I rushed to her and untied the ropes. She sobbed and hugged me, her body shaking. He's here, Jake. He said if you came, he'd kill us both. I listened. It was quiet. But suddenly there was a creaking sound from behind, someone slowly approaching. I stood in front of Laura, trying to cover her with me. Who do we have here? Came a hoarse voice from the darkness. A hooded man stepped out from behind a shelf. His face was half hidden by the shadows, but I recognized the familiar features: the same sharp nose, the same deep-set eyes. He looked like Brian, but older and tougher. You think you can take her? He wheezed. Are you Brian? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm the one who was there for her when you didn't even know she existed. She's mine. Laura squirmed behind me, but I didn't back down. You're just a sick lunatic. She'll never be with you. You don't understand. His voice became almost affectionate. We're bound to her forever. I promised I'd come back when I grew up. I've kept my word. I realized that talking wasn't going to help. I slowly reached for the phone in my pocket, but Brian saw it and grabbed the knife. Don't you dare. She's mine. I've been waiting for her for so many years. Laura suddenly jumped up and lunged at him from behind, trying to dislodge the knife. I lunged forward and knocked him to the floor. We struggled, rolling around on the dirty floor. Brian was stronger, but at some point I elbowed him in the face and he loosened his grip. Laura picked up the fallen knife and tossed it aside. I pinned Brian to the ground and Laura called the police. He lashed out, screaming something incoherent, but I held him until the cops arrived. When the police took Brian away, Laura was still in shock. We sat on Kate's porch and were silent. Finally, Laura spoke. I remember him watching me from around the corner of the house when I was a kid. I thought it was just a fantasy. But he was always there. Even when I moved in with my grandmother. I hugged her, feeling the anger building inside. This man had ruined her childhood and now he was trying to ruin her adult life. We later learned that Brian had been living in an abandoned house near their old home for several years. The police found his notes there, pages of notes about Laura, her habits, her favorite places. He hadn't stopped following her all this time. It's been months. Laura went to a psychologist, trying to get rid of her guilt and fear. I was always there for her, supporting her. We decided to move to another city to start fresh. One night I was sitting in the kitchen watching the news on my phone. Suddenly, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. You didn't protect her then. You can't now. I dropped the phone and felt a chill run down my back. Laura was asleep in the next room, and I didn't want to wake her. I checked the number, blocked. The next morning I told Laura, but she tried to dismiss it. Jake, he's sitting in protective custody. It's just someone's evil joke. But in the back of my mind, I could sense that someone was still watching us. The next day, I decided to check the security tapes again. On one of the night tapes, I noticed a shadow near the window. I zoomed in, a hooded man was standing there looking directly into the camera, and then slowly raised his hand and showed his finger to his lips. Shoo. Sometimes the shadows of the past don't disappear, even when you're sure it's over. They remain to remind you, fear never goes away for good.